All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for attending today's webinar. The topic is what are jurisdictions doing to improve efficiency? The webinar will be recorded and sent out to all attendees. The Colorado Energy Office is now posting them on the Code Adoption Toolkit, which links to YouTube. My name is Erica DeLello, and I'm a project manager for Noresco. And this series is sponsored by Colorado Energy Office with training materials created by Hope Medina at Shumskoda Associates. So Hope and I have been working with Colorado Energy Office to provide trainings just like this one. We've got a list up here on the screen that kind of outlays over the next year which webinars we'll be doing. And I know that Excel is also putting out webinars, so keep an eye out for those too. And then we also do offer group trainings that are tailored to that specific group, or technical assistance for jurisdictions that are updating I-codes. So if you do have any questions about that, feel free to reach out to me and I can provide you with additional information. And then most of you probably know about the Code Adoption Toolkit, but just to reiterate a little bit, we've got a bunch of really great resources on there, but the one that I really want to highlight today is the Code Helpline, and you can access this through the Code Adoption Toolkit, and there's a link right here, and there's also a drop down. Page scrolls down below, so feel free to check that out. You can submit any questions about if you're a jurisdiction and need a plan review assistance, or you're a homeowner and need or an engineer with a question about code applicability. You can submit a ticket, and a subject matter expert like Hope will get back to you in just a couple days' time. So feel free to use that. It's a resource for any industry professionals out there in Colorado. And then throughout the webinar, just a couple of housekeeping items. We want to encourage questions, so please use that Q&A function, and I'll let our presenter know at the end. There's also the ability to raise your hand to ask a question at the end of the presentation, and I can unmute you. And then lastly, there's a survey window that will pop up following the webinar. Please take a moment to provide feedback so we can continue to improve on these webinars and develop new resources for jurisdictions and industry professionals. So today, the presenter is Hope Medina, and Hope Medina is an energy and green consultant for Shumskoda Associates. She's worked on a national level to develop, promote, and assist with adopting energy and green codes. She's a governing member of the IECC Sustainability Membership Council, a consensus committee member, and task group chair of the National Green Standard for several cycles now. So with that, Hope, I'll let you take it from here.
Just get my screen up here. Just want to make sure you can see the lovely light bulb that's going off everywhere. All right. Well, welcome everyone. And just to kind of hit a little bit on what Erica was mentioning about the hotline, it is a fantastic tool. I know we've already had homeowners asking, and builders and code officials. It's just a great tool. So with that being said, let's start talking about what jurisdictions are actually doing to improve efficiency. Now, when we start talking about improving efficiency, that is really a wide range of a topic that not everyone's going to fit into this nice little box. There's going to be all these scattered boxes, but all of these scattered boxes ultimately does improve what efficiency is. So with that being said, there we go. This class is also going to be very interactive. So here is the first opportunity for you to get the buzzer out and click on the right button. So we are going to poll you, and the question is your jurisdiction planning on adopting a newer code in the next year, or have you worked in a jurisdiction that it has intended to move to a new code for those that aren't code officials. So we'll give it a couple of seconds here, a minute, to get everybody in the mood of finding their mouse and clicking on that. All right, so it looks like the code that I guess has the biggest impact right now is there is an awful lot of interest in adopting the 2021. There's still jurisdictions that are looking at to adopt the 2018, a couple that are not at this time, and then I'm not sure. Now, the reason why, you know, we would ask this is there's a few things that really come into play when you start talking about improving efficiency. Sometimes improving efficiency is adopting a newer code. It doesn't mean you have to do all, you know, some really crazy concepts to improve efficiency. Sometimes it is just absolutely adopting that newer code. You know, we have jurisdictions in Colorado that may be on an older code, maybe a 2003, 2006, 2009, and just hasn't had, you know, really any construction that warranted moving to, you know, newer codes, including the I codes. And now you are getting that type of construction. And so it makes sense to go to the 2018. And by doing that, you are increasing your efficiency that's happening. Now, the DOE made a determination for the 2021 IECC that it was basically a 9% improvement residentially from the 2018 to the 2021 and 4%, I believe, on the commercial side of things. So even going from the 18 to the 21, you are increasing your efficiency. Sorry, there we go. So as a jurisdiction, there is a lot of different concepts, as I stated, as far as what do you consider to be improving your efficiency and what are your community's goals to improve that efficiency. And that could be, as we just stated, adopting a newer code. That's going to improve it. Maybe you're going to have a stretch code that actually goes beyond whatever is in that base of the code to improve that efficiency. And maybe your idea is going to be to go to net zero energy, having a plan to get to net zero energy. Maybe it's that you want to have some sustainable practices. It's becoming more and more of a joint effort here in Colorado as we're a home ruled state that the sustainability coordinator is actually working with the building department and trying to, you know, really be able to get to everybody's goals, you know, some sustainable practices, you know, adopting newer codes and how can they work together. And it's something that, you know, you're seeing more of, you know, which encompasses more than energy, but encompasses energy, you know, things like, you know, water efficiency, you know, the type of materials, where you're going to build. Is that a greenfield site? You know, you can't build on a greenfield site. Let's use something that's, you know, already existing. So there are some things. And then there's the concept and the goals of wanting to install more renewable energy in your community. And carbon reduction. That's one of those, you know, catchphrase words now that everybody's talking about, carbon reduction. We want to reduce our carbon footprint as a community. So how do you do that? And it seems to be almost now linked up with energy components and the energy code, right? So now the energy code has adopted somewhat of the carbon reduction deal. And then, you know, jurisdictions are looking at dual fuel, you know, possibilities and requirements and how to deal with that. And then, of course, the big one, right? The one that everybody probably is really talking about. It's the latest fad word. Not that that's a bad thing, just it's the latest and greatest now, which is electrification. You know, a lot of communities want to go towards electrification because of certain goals that they have. And so these are some of the concepts and some of the goals that the communities around Colorado are really looking at. And they're looking at it in the aspect of wanting to improve their efficiency. So again, let's talk about net zero energy. And I would like for you all to pull out your buzzers again and utilize the poll. So does your community have any plans to become a net zero energy community, or are you working in a jurisdiction right now that is a net zero community? Give it a couple of seconds here for everybody. They should be all warmed up, ready to go. All right, Erica, if you wouldn't mind posting results. Okay, so it appears at the moment for those that are on here, the biggest impact is not at this time. The next is within the next 10 years, your community is looking at net zero energy. We have some that are looking at 5 years, and we do have architects and engineers that have worked in communities that are requiring net zero energy. So that's very, very interesting to see. Oops, get it to move. There we go. So when we start talking about net zero energy, this is one of those concepts that has been around for a while. It's a newer trend, but it's been in discussions probably, I don't know, the last 10 years, but it's really kind of gained some momentum as of late with some of the goals that communities have set for themselves and the acceptance and the technology to really be able to achieve this. So what exactly does it mean to be a net zero energy building, right? Because that's really important. You throw these words around, but often these words get thrown around and it's not necessarily known what exactly we're talking about. So let's think about what it says in the IECC. Oh, well, in the IECC, there actually is no definition for net zero energy. Well, let's think about what ASHRAE has. So ASHRAE 90.1 also does not have a definition for what net zero energy means. Now, there are some programs out there that do have it defined as far as what it is, but ultimately, when everything is said and done, for you as a community, if this is a possibility or an area that you're wanting to utilize to increase your efficiency, it becomes the responsibility of the community to actually define how you are interpreting what net zero energy is. And there are communities out there that have done that. Denver has defined what they're considering net zero energy, and so are other communities within Colorado, and for that matter, communities outside of Colorado that have taken the time to really define it. Because if you don't define what it is you're trying to attain, how do you know you've actually attained it? So when you start talking about net zero energy, ultimately, the basic concept for it is, are you producing enough energy to offset the amount of energy that is being used, right? So how do you go about being able to produce the energy that you need to offset that energy? And so part of it is you have to not so much focus on producing the energy, but you have to really focus on the energy that you're using. How are you using that energy? How are you mitigating that energy use? So one of the areas that you're going to take a look at is your thermal envelope. And so if you have goals to be a net zero energy, you really have to have an efficient, robust, building shell. That thermal envelope has to be good. And it's not just the concept of increasing the R value so that you have pink in the wall this thick, right? That's not, the concept of, of a robust building shell. It's an assembly. It's thinking of it as a whole. That means you have a good installation of that insulation. Is that a grade 1? Is it a grade 2? Obviously we want a grade 1, but you also have to think about your air sealing, right? We don't want air leakage, because when air is able to infiltrate or escape, obviously that means your energy usage is, escaping right along with it. So it's an assembly, right? It's your air barriers, it's the air sealing, it's the insulation, so it's an assembly as a whole that's really going to be able to help you when you start talking about the energy that's being used. And of course, what's the biggest thing that's going to utilize the most energy? And that's going to be the equipment that you utilize to condition the building, right? And so that's where things like making sure that you do mechanical load calculations that are required out of the IMC and required out of the IECC, so that you can determine that the commercial mechanical equipment that's being installed has been sized appropriately, that it's not too big or even too small for what the project is requiring. And that's also where manual J reviews and manual Ds come in. You're taking a look at, on the residential side, is that mechanical equipment, sized for what you need? Because you don't want to have something obviously oversized for many reasons. But when you start talking about, being a net zero community, oversized equipment really is a detriment in being able to get there. And then of course, renewable energy, right? This is where the production has to come in. And when you start talking about renewable energy, even though you say renewable energy, I think as a whole, you're really thinking about solar, because solar could be very easily installed across the board, in the sense that for whether you're a residential project or you're a commercial project, potentially you have space on the roof to be able to do that. Whereas, renewable energy coming from like a wind turbine, I don't know too many jurisdictions that would permit a wind turbine sitting on top of a single family home. That probably isn't going to be permitted for your zoning ordinances and so forth. So when you talk about renewable energy, the thought behind it, I think for most people, is you start thinking about PV systems. So then, you don't necessarily have to start from scratch when you start thinking about and talking about, net zero energy. The IECC in the 2021 does have 2 appendices that did come in, one on the residential side and one on the commercial side. Now, on the residential side, it's actually a fairly easy pathway to utilize to get to net zero energy. It's very similar to what another jurisdiction in Colorado has been using for years now, when they adopted the 2015 IECC to incorporate into their net zero program. It's very similar, and it does utilize the ERI path to get there, which is a really, I think, a useful way and a enforceable way and a thought way to really be able to get to the net zero energy on the residential side. Now, on the commercial side of this particular appendix, and this is an appendix that doesn't necessarily address the energy efficiency components of a commercial project. It basically is talking about what you need to do to put on renewable energy to offset that. Personally, I had an issue with that particular code change from the very beginning. So it's one that it depends on how your jurisdiction really wants to focus and work with net zero energy as to how and what programs are out there to really be able to utilize and get your community to where you want to go. So as I said, this is the latest and greatest as far as trends that communities are really looking for, because they want to increase their energy efficiency. They want to reduce their carbon footprint. They want to provide, reduce their greenhouse gases. And to do that, one of the concepts that is really going around is the electrification concept. Now, there's some pros and cons when you start talking about electrification, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. But what I would like to do is to ask all of you, is your community considering going with electrification, depending on, whether it's full electrification ready, or are you an architect or a contractor or a builder that has been working in a community or has worked in a community that is working on electrification? Okay, so it looks like at the moment, the biggest one is that not at this time. There are some plans for electrification ready. There is some to have full electrification within the next year, and then some that aren't sure. And currently we have some contractors and architects and builders that have worked in one or are currently working in a jurisdiction with electrification plans. So that's really, really interesting. Like I said, it's one of those concepts that's really being brought to the forefront of the conversations. And there are jurisdictions right now that are working within their codes, their building codes, to address this. There we go. So when you start talking about electrification, you can't really state, I want to have electrification right now. Tomorrow, we are going to be a community that has full electrification. For electrification to really be successful, you need to have an implementation plan. You have to have some sort of plan to get there. And so it's going to be steps to be able to really bring you forward and really bring you to what your ultimate goal is. And the reason why I say that is because, there can be ramifications for electrification. And so you want to make sure that your program is successful for what your intention is. And so, again, you really have to think about what that thermal envelope is. And you also have to think about, when you start talking about electrification, you have to think about your solar provisions. And the reason for that is, if you are truly wanting to go full electrification, you have to have that conversation with like your utility company, because are you trying to have full electrification, but you're trying to be self-supporting and self-producing of the electricity that is needed to have the electrification? Or are you wanting to have electrification without necessarily having the steps and the solar provisions installed, which then would fall on to the utility company to be able to provide the increase in electricity for your particular community. Now, there was a community a few years ago, and I will preface, well, I won't say where it was, but I will say it was not within Colorado. They wanted to do full electrification. And so it came from their council, it came down. And so any new builds had to be fully have electrification. And then if you were doing any remodeling, at that point, it kicked in for that. So what happened over the course of a year, they were basically fully electrified as far as their community. At the very beginning of all of this, when they implemented it, they were paying 3 cents a kilowatt an hour. At the end, in a year, when everything was fully, they were paying 13 cents an hour. So that's one of those unintended consequences. And typically when you start talking about electrification, it's because you have the goal for carbon reduction and, having, cleaner energy. But then, you have to get the additional electricity, from others. So then you start having to, worry about those types of concepts. So you have to think about, what you're going to do with your solar. So many locations that have considered going with electrification, what they did with, either their previous adoption or with this adoption is they're utilizing the solar ready provisions, which is an appendix out of the IECC for both commercial and residential. And then it's also duplicated in the IRC. Or what they did do is they required it for the solar ready. And then this go around, what they're doing is they're just outright requiring that solar is going to be installed on the home. So they're more self-sufficient with their electrification as opposed to having to utilize an outside source for their electrification. But whether you are doing ready or required, there's a few things that, has to be thought about, and has to be thought about, from the, building department when the community, when they're adopting their codes, they have to think about that, get their building community prepared for it. And then the architects have to be aware of it so that they can prepare the plans accordingly. And then the contractors know that they have to kind of abide by what's going on. And when I talk about that, that's because when you start thinking about it, there are so many components on a roof already that everybody has to get along, right? You've got vents up on the roof dealing with, attic ventilation or B vents. And then you've got piping because you're venting. And then of course you've got skylights, right? Whether you're a commercial community or a commercial project that, you have potential skylight requirements, or you're a residential that you're choosing to have skylights, they are still playing up on the roof. And then you've got solar panels, right? So, oh my, you've got all that going on the roof. And so, communities are really making you think about it. And even though the solar ready provisions do state that, all these areas where you designate your solar ready zone, can't have any, venting and pipes and skylights and all that good stuff. They're making it very clear that this can't be there. And they're making sure that their building community knows that, their contractors, the subs, everybody, they try to get the word out for that. And so for electrification, there really isn't an answer that you're going to find within the IECC, right? So you have to start looking outside of the IECC to be able to really determine what can you do to be more efficient with what your goals are. And so this is where that concept of dual fuel really does come into play. And so I am going to ask if Erica could put up the poll. So my question for you, is your jurisdiction looking at dual fuel requirements? Or are you currently working or have worked in a jurisdiction that does have dual fuel requirements? And just in case you may not know what dual fuel is, but basically it's you're providing an option. If you wouldn't mind leaving it up there for a little bit, Erica, as I explain this. It's basically, so if you are going to install a gas-fired appliance, say that you're installing a gas stove, then you would run a gas line to the stove. And what dual fuel says is, okay, fine, you're going to run that gas line to the stove, but now you're also going to install that 240 receptacle so that later on down the road, as the gas stove gets replaced, ultimately, hopefully what they're going to do is they're going to install this electric stove in there. And so then they don't have to do any more further construction with that. It's just already set and go. And so it makes it really simple for occupants in a building to be able to replace it with the electric appliance that by the time this would go into effect would be a mandated. Maybe you aren't going to allow gas at all, but this is one of those steps to be able to get there. So with that explanation, I'll give you a second and then we'll go ahead and take a look at the poll. Okay. So there are communities right now that are looking at or they are having dual fuel requirements. There's some that aren't, and there are some that aren't too sure. Apparently, we don't have anybody right now who has worked in one or is currently working in one. And so dual fuel is really one of those ways to, like I said, really prep builds for later on when the community becomes fully electrified. Because quite honestly, I have spoken with quite a few communities, and that is one of their goals, is that they are wanting to go to full electrification. And the thought process that's going on is the fact that for all of these years, right, for years and years and years, fossil fueled or, fuel fired appliances was really what was being installed, right? And so now when you start saying, hey, full electrification, you have to start looking at things like, the panel, right? Can the panel support it? Do you have enough, receptacles? Is it the right type of receptacles? Do you have the conduit leading to wherever it needs to be? And so all of those have been thought about, and it's really being brought forward. So, okay, we know that we can't do it today. We cannot have full electrification today, but we know 5 years from now, that's our ultimate plan. So what we need to do is take those steps to do it. And so that's one of the things that they're suggesting. Now, I will say, while this wasn't a requirement that's in the 2021 IECC, there was a code proposal that brought in electrification ready, which is basically what I've talked about. You're going to put the gas in, but you're also going to install the electrical counterpart for that so that it's ready, when you're building the home for later on, if they go in that direction. And so it was there. It went through a process. It was part of the appeal process to the 2021 and ultimately, was not moved forward. Oops. So now that we've mentioned a few of these things, I guess we have to really talk about that elephant that is in the room, right? And that's our mechanical equipment. When you start talking about electrification and you want to have full electrification, here in Colorado, we have an awful lot of air conditioners along the Front Range, right? And we also have a lot of, gas furnaces, right? Or boilers. And so we now have to think about how are we going to address these types of things. And it's something that for those communities that are working on it, there are a few ideas on what you need to do. Now, the IECC on the residential side and the commercial side has requirements as far as the HVAC equipment, what their efficiency is. Now, on the commercial side, if y'all recall, there's like 16 tables that breaks out, the type of mechanical equipment with what the efficiency is. And then on the commercial or on the residential side, it talks about it has to meet the minimum federal efficiency requirements. What you find in the code book, those numbers are actually what the minimum efficiency, federal minimum efficiency requirements are. And every cycle they get updated. They get updated by one particular person who has taken that on, because it doesn't automatically kick in, although now I believe it will automatically kick in. But that's what we have to require. We as jurisdictions have to require what's in there, and we have to require what the minimum is. Now, an architect or a contractor, owner, designer, whatever the case may be, engineer may say, hey, I want to put in something that's more efficient than what the minimum is. And that's perfectly okay. They can choose to do that. We as a jurisdiction cannot require that they install something that's above what's listed as the federal minimum, because then that starts getting into the concern of federal preemption, right? So when you start talking about that, you have goals, you want to do some of this. So what do you do? What are your options, right? And one of the options that has become rather popular is the concept of having either going fully electrification, saying all of the equipment has to be electric, or you have to have it, the infrastructure in for it, or it's either an electric appliance or it's a more efficient fuel-fired appliance. So that's where your option comes in for that. So remember, I said it can be an option. You just can't mandate that they do. So what efficiencies then do you start requiring? Do you just pick numbers saying, hey, you have to have something more efficient? Does it have to be, the minimum is 80? Does it have to be 81 to be, for it to happen? So then you start thinking about how can you determine what's going to be the best opportunity to really get that equipment efficiency, but still staying within the parameters of, really what's permitted. And that's where you're going to come back to the IECC, because the IECC does have some options and possibilities for you, right? We're very familiar on the commercial side where there was section 406, and 406 is your additional efficiency packages. And it gave you, like 8 options. You could do A, B, C, D, E, or F, right? And you could choose one of those. Well, one of those happened to be more efficient HVAC equipment. And so here is where you can say, hey, you have to install electric or install more efficient HVAC equipment in accordance with C406.2, which says, you either have to do the 5% or the 10%, which then you could, choose which one would make the most sense, because saying 5% or 10% is much better than trying to recreate 16 tables, right? And so that is a possibility. And the nice thing is now on the residential side of things, in the 2021, there is the new section that came in, which is R408, and it's the residential counterpart to the commercial, and it's an additional efficiency package. And R408.2.2 has a requirement for more efficient HVAC equipment. And then it also provides the information for that, right? So you have a 95 AFUE natural gas appliance and a 16 SEER, air conditioner. So great. It gives you some guidance in something that's already been vetted, and you're not just pulling numbers out of the air. So whenever you start talking about wanting to have more efficiency, it's not necessarily something that you can do like tomorrow, right? I want to have more efficiency tomorrow. And sure, it always has to start with that concept or that idea, but you really have to have a plan of how you want to get there and what actions you want to take to get there to really be successful at it. And so these are some of the things that, I feel would be a benefit no matter what path you want to utilize, whether you want, more efficient HVAC equipment, or you want electrification or dual fuel, or you want, net zero energy. These are some of the basic concepts that are going to be, necessary as far as really being successful to do it. And the first is, you got to think about new versus existing, right? That new house has every opportunity to be able to install all of the electrical that you want, or to be able to have the solar installed so that you can be at net zero, or, have that whatever the case may be, you can always incorporate into how you're going to design it and ultimately be able to build it. Where plans and concepts and goals really have an issue, and that where you can actually stumble is, what do you do with your existing, right? What do you do with that 100-year-old house that you are not going to be able to install that solar on the roof because the loads aren't, that roof isn't going to be able to handle those loads, but yet you have to be fully electrified, by 2025, right? So whatever the case may be, you have to think about how you're going to handle both the new and the existing. And sometimes, when you start talking about existing, it may be, houses built before 1963 will be exempt from that. And there's nothing wrong with that particular concept of it, just because, the idea is, you're always trying to, make it better than what it was, and not trying to be a detriment for it. And so that's something to really consider and think about it. And of course, I think you've probably figured out from the conversation that we've had today that everything really truly does begin and end with that thermal envelope. All of your goals really start with that thermal envelope. And that right there can be where you really are going to be able to make an impact on being more efficient. Whether that's, how it's installed, making sure all the information is provided on the plan so that it can be installed, in the way that it, was designed to be, while everybody understands it's not like you hook up that air conditioner to the insulation to power it, right? That's not where your efficiency comes from. But because you have a good thermal envelope that's been designed and installed properly, that means that you can have, smaller equipment, which that's where your energy efficiency improvement comes from. And then of course, size does matter. As we stated, where you're going to be able to help get to your goals is the fact that you aren't having to utilize, incredibly large equipment. You can reduce that size down, and which will help you to be able to get to net zero, or, for you to be fully self-sufficient with electrification. And then let's talk about what departments are involved, because that really can help you in being successful, because, maybe more in the past than what's currently going on is often it was talked about, we want to do these types of things, but maybe the building department wasn't necessarily included on it, but then it was kind of dropped in the building department's lap to kind of figure out how to enforce it and do it. And the great thing is, and I'm so happy to say it, is that truly isn't necessarily the case now. There's an awful lot of interdepartment communication and working. And I just worked with a jurisdiction, or I've been working with them. And the nice thing is, for the code adoption, it wasn't just the building department that was working on this. And they did have, solar that, they're wanting installed. They do have electrification requirements. They do have higher efficiency mechanical equipment. They do have a net zero energy. So they're basically trying to do everything that I just covered in this webinar. And to do that, they had the planning department installed in there. They had their zoning there. They had their development in there. They had their sustainability, and they had their building department all talking with each other and meeting on a weekly basis to discuss how they can all work together to get to what their community goals are. And I think that they've done an excellent job with that. And so this is where I truly feel that it can really make or break how you want your goals to look like and how your improvement on efficiency can be. And so just wanted to let you know that there is some upcoming training. We have some that's a joint training actually between Colorado Energy Office and Excel Energy on December 7th in Pueblo. The first 2 hours will be an overview of the 2021 IECC, and then the second session will be an overview of the 2018 IECC. And then, as you can see here too, are the list of webinars that are coming up from now until the end of the year. And with that, I just want to thank you all and see if you have any questions.
Thanks, Hope. Would you mind actually putting that link to the Excel webinars and how people can register in the chat?
Oh, yes, I can put that in there.
That'd be great. Yeah, and if anyone has any questions, feel free to raise your hand or write in the Q&A box if you have any questions. Hope and I will stay on the line for a few more minutes.